So just to let everyone know, this panel, you may have noticed originally was going to be 6 people, but actually 7 people, and there were going to be 8 of us up here. So we decided to change it up a little bit. So I've divided panel 5 into 2 groups. This is the first half. Then we will have the second half. The panel itself, we termed legalization and access, and it's been occurring to me that in some ways that's both too general and too specific. We are, I think, all in this group aware that we're in a forward-moving train related to psychedelics, and I think if I had to pick one theme that maybe will be sprinkled throughout all of the rest of the day, it's sort of how might we do it better? We're sort of moving forward, and how might that happen? How might that happen better? And so. With that, I want to introduce our first speaker on the topic, can psychedelics trigger psychotic disorders in young people? Toward evidence-based public policy for risk management in psychedelic legalization. And Hyun Kim is the founder and director of the Psychiatric Training and Outreach Clinical High Risk for Psychosis program, and a child and adolescent psychiatrist in the Division of Psychotic Disorders at McLean Hospital, and an instructor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right, so I primarily work with adolescents and young adults who are at risk of developing psychotic disorder. So that's why I got interested in this topic. So I received small funding from SAMHSA for my work in a psychosis space, but I do not have any conflicts of interest on this topic. All right, so I'm not going to spend much time in terms of the historical aspect of psychedelics. We all know these compounds have been around for 1,000 years, right? In terms of its introduction to Western modern society, it starts with the discovery of LSD, and then fast forward over the following couple of decades, there's a rapid sort of these compounds, especially LSD, rapidly gains its reputation as a quote wonder drug, and then over the following decade, again, it sort of really crashes hard and everything is shut down. So that's kind of all of us what we know. But is there anything else in the history that could be useful to learn about more? So I want to draw your attention to one particular additional aspect in the history. So with increasing popularity, not just among psychiatric community, but also lay community, these compounds started escape research laboratories and clinical practice, and there was increased use, unsupervised use in the community happening. And with that, the society started to see adverse events happening, oftentimes requiring inpatient psychiatric admissions. And then, people started writing about all these sort of phenomena of psychological complications, with the prolonged psychosis being one of the major concerns in the community. So that's what happened back then. And with this trend, there was an article writing about some of the clinical guidelines, pretty thoughtful. What are the kind of potential ways we can prevent this sort of instance, and also what are the ways of manage, adverse events such as prolonged psychosis, like using antipsychotics. And with the historical precaution, now our current psychedelic research has implemented important safety measures. The first one being careful screening of the study subjects, excluding certain kind of vulnerable populations that have been identified, such as individuals who are at risk of developing psychotic disorders. And the other important measure being provide good enough safety containers, such as rigorous psychological support throughout the process. And with these protocols in place, the current era of research community has been able to produce really, meaningful, productive, outcomes in terms of demonstrating these compounds' therapeutic potentials and also its utility for advancing our neuroscience. However, on the other hand, the risk profile of these substances, they need to be understood better, especially when it comes down to the question, how much this data can be generalized to the real-world setting, because there will be vulnerable individuals who have been excluded in these trials. And of course, there are a number of studies trying to look at this risk profile, especially in its relation with the psychosis risk. But unfortunately, because we do not have these subjects in the current clinical trials, so most of these studies they are based on naturalistic study design. What that means is like there are a lot of innate methodological limitations and challenges, which really makes the interpretation of the study findings very much challenging. And then there are a lot of questions about its validity. Okay, so that is the study part and research. Then, what are the kind of messages our public is getting? Can psychedelics save the world? Or can it solve our youth mental health crisis? Or maybe it can boost your work productivity or creativity. So these are kind of messages our public is getting. And as there was discussion earlier, so in our community, in psychiatric community, and also even within psychedelic research community, there has been increasing concern that, I think this is sort of a public perception to kind of outpassing the science at this point. This is becoming bubble, it's hype, and also, partially driven by this coming influx of a large investment, mostly coming from private capital, and also this social pressure along with nationwide policy reform that's been happening rapidly over the past few years. And this is what we see. So what is the impact? What kind of, impact this trend can have on our young people? The instance of the prevalence of psychedelic use among young adults, there has been sharp increase over the past few years after decades-long plateau stage. And it's not just for young adults. This was a study that was published earlier this year, looking at the number of psilocybin cases that were reported to U.S. Poison Control Center, and they conducted 10-year analysis from 2013 through 2022, and you don't really need a fancy statistical analysis to kind of look at what's happening. Starting around 2018, 2019, and we all know what those years mean. Before then there was a plateau stage. Afterwards, there has been sharp increase in terms of reported cases, doubling among young adults and more than tripling among adolescents. So why this trend matter? Why this does matter? Because all substances, any compounds, they can be cured or they can be poison, depending on who's taking it and how they are being managed. There's no exception to that statement, including psychedelics as well. As a professional who's working with young people who are at risk of developing psychotic disorders, this is a great concern. These individuals, they haven't developed psychotic symptoms yet, and they do not necessarily have a family history of psychotic disorders either, all right? They are identified as a state of heightened vulnerability for developing such conditions. And their age range is somewhere around from early teens through mid-20s. A couple of key facts that would be useful to know, to remember, that can be relevant when you think about policy considerations. The first one, as I said, these people, they do not present with full-blown psychotic symptoms yet. However, on the other hand, they do struggle with a wide range of different kinds of mental health struggles. It could look like a depression, it can look like different kinds of anxiety, it can be some sort of mood dysregulation or behavior issues, or it can be substance use struggles. And the other fact that is important, the fact that they are identified as a CHR youth in that stage doesn't mean that they will necessarily develop psychotic disorders moving forward. It's a very fluid stage. That's what we know by research. Depending on what kind of interventions can be given, how much we can preventive measures, including avoid any kind of potential toxins in their lifestyle, they can have different prognosis and different trajectory. So now let's talk about policy considerations. What are the ways, potential kind of topics or questions we can think about to minimize potential psychosis risk for these young people in our society? And of course, when you talk about policy, it's such a complex topic. I don't like talking about it because there's so much complexity. There are so many pros and cons, and it's not just about psychosis. It's not even just about mental health. There's so much, more like social, legal, political matters that we need to kind of weigh. However, I'm going to focus on psychosis risk specifically. One question we can think about is what is the age of legal age? All right. The bottom line is we delay the exposure for their developing brain. That's going to continue through mid-20s. The risk will likely go lower. The other one is a policy around substance regulation issues such as potency and also purity issues. There's not so much direct evidence coming from psychedelics. However, common sense dictates more potent the drug or substances, more likely the individual will experience some form of adverse events. Disclaimer, if you want to put require some sort of disclaimer for consumers about its potential psychosis risk, if we do so, what kind of languages can be used, that is another consideration. And the last one would be assess and also set standard about psychedelic practice. And then there are many subdomains that we can talk about. Each of them can be individual topic of the paper. Education would be a huge one. I cannot emphasize this enough. I don't think, putting up some sort of pretty-looking, nice sort of resources, online resources website that is nowhere close to good enough. I do think we need a really proactive and more honestly, very aggressive education outreach with good scientific communications, especially, there's so much misinformation, disinformation that is everywhere, especially for young people. And considering funding allocation to support these kind of education activity, that is another one. Another funding for crisis intervention support, because guess what? Teenagers, they're going to figure it out. They're going to get it somehow, right? Adverse event monitoring, enforcing building the infrastructure. We can monitor these events as we move forward so that we have a system that will be informed and run by the data moving forward. That would be very important too. Government funding, that would be nice so we have more nuance and balanced research, right? So I'm not here standing against psychedelic science or even psychedelic policy reform. I'm here standing against hype bubble that's been unfortunately created and also to prevent any kind of unwanted consequences on our young people. Because after all, yes, good science matters and good clinical practice matters, but we all know that good policy, it matters so much. So I understand that Matthew put this slide earlier at the beginning. We didn't coordinate this, but I thought it really captures the message that I'm trying to convey today. And thank you so much for your attention.
Questions? Mason.
I think everyone would probably agree that delaying use by adolescents as long as possible while their brains are developing is probably the right idea. So what do you think of criminalization as a policy to achieve that? And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the American Medical Association just opining that we should decriminalize drugs. I'm just curious.
I think that is a completely, in a sense, a different topic. I'm talking about this, the concerns about the trend of increasing unsupervised use in the community, especially among young people, right? I think that is we talk about that is a much more broader topic. There are so many different things and different aspects that we need to weigh. And I had a discussion with some people last night, including Matthew Johnson. It's not just about psychedelics. There is so much that the criminalization of the substance use and negative consequences that's been happening over years or so. Yeah, that's where so much I know. I'm still in terms of that social and also more of a broader a political kind of aspect of that part is I'm still in the process of learning, honestly. I'm here to share my perspectives based on my clinical experience and also research experience. But at the same time, I'm here to learn as well.
Sarah?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed this, although between your comments and ILS yesterday about teenagers, I'm having a couple myself and now pretty terrified. But I was wondering, you were talking about teenagers who are already prone or vulnerable to developing psychosis, and I was wondering is that something that has grown over time, where there's more people, more teenagers are vulnerable to that, or is that something where knowledge about it has grown over time? I'm just wondering if that sort of separate from the psychedelic piece, although I understand that will up the risk factor. Has that changed over time?
So I think it might be helpful to kind of give a little bit of sort of the facts in terms of the neurodevelopmental aspect and how that plays into psychosis development. I can start with the age of onset. So in terms of the first age of onset, the sort of peak age of onset for first episode psychosis for men, typically it ranges somewhere between like late teens through early 20s. And for women, it ranges somewhere between early 20s to like a late 20s, right? So that is the sort of peak age of a first onset psychosis. And there's in terms of the neuro sort of the science findings, there are critical brain development process happening, and then it's been very well established fact that there are a lot of the brain development that continues to happen, including maturation process through at least mid-20s. So it's still in terms of like what is happening exactly, and then what can be done. There's a lot of research happening, like there's a lot of theories and things like that. But there's the important sort of emphasis that because it's not like developing psychotic disorders, for example, such as like schizophrenia or even bipolar disorders with psychotic features. It's not like just genes and genetic factors that are dictating. There's this concept of the gene-environment interaction. What that means, with a certain kind of genetic predisposition, you get sort of some kind of insults by environmental factors, and through that interface interaction, especially during this critical development period, it can sort of start that psychotic cascade at some point. So that is sort of the concept. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the environmental factors, because those are in interplay, those have sort of bumped up the likelihood of psychosis. And I should have said I wasn't scared for that reason, but that was the academic question. It was just that everybody says all the kids are going to grow.
Yeah. And then there are a number of factors that identify, such as like in terms of environmental factors, like trauma, growing up in urban places, and cannabis that's been of course, getting huge attention in terms of, like age factors, the potency, and also use the frequency of use. Those are factors that has been established in terms of showing high risk association in terms of cannabis. Yeah.
Franklin.
So I have a couple of questions. So we know, I see this all the time, I work in psychiatric emergency room, people develop mania, either first episode of mania or destabilization out of bipolar disorder in response to some sort of heavy stress on the person, being fired from work, a divorce, big emotional strain.
Yeah.
Seems to have something to do with tipping people into developing mania. I'm not familiar with any literature relating emotional or psychological stress as being an identified factor of tipping people into the first episode of primary psychotic disorders, but I'm wondering if there's literature for that. The reason I ask is because one of the theories for why psychedelics works is the 5-HT2A system essentially is a stress response system that exists to create adaptive neuroplasticity in response to stressors, but the psychedelics essentially are putting a major stress on the brain instead of naturally occurring stress.
Yeah.
So that potential risk doesn't see in the high risk groups or not.
And in fact, not so much that level of neurobiology, but even like from old literature, there has been sort of a description that's been that I read about how like there's sort of like a testing the hypothesis, because it was sort of like still psychoanalysis that was like a very reputable and prominent theory back then, those days, right? So when you get this level of something important that needs to be processed, which oftentimes comes with a significant amount of stress response, and how that doesn't get navigated well enough, that might be related to basically, like really challenging your ego system or whatever that we use in those theory, and that they can lead to psychosis break. Obviously it's not like something studied, right? But I think it kind of echoes with the sort of the theory that you are talking about. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Hyun Shams, who will deliver her paper called Beyond the Trip, A Legal Odyssey Charting the Course for Psychedelic Innovation in Law and Policy. Hyun is the data curator at Porta Sophia, and you will all learn what that is.
Alright, first, can everybody hear me? Is my sound doing its job?
Get a little closer.
How about now? A little better?
A little more.
A little more? Alright, how about now?
Yes.
Better? Alright, perfect. So, as our moderator so graciously introduced me, my name is Dr. Hyun Shams, and I'm a data and patent analyst with the online psychedelic prior art library in Porta Sophia. And I'm going to be talking to you today about maintaining psychedelic access through intellectual property interventions. So, first, I'm briefly going to talk about the prior art problem that's still at the center of this ongoing threat to this space. And then I'm going to cover 2 of 4 parts of our manuscript. First, looking at protecting access through intellectual property interventions at the pre-grant stage. And then 2, some policy reforms to the system that can promote a more equitable patent landscape. So the patent examination process from beginning to end is critically influenced by what prior art is available to the examiner throughout the course of examination. But unfortunately, as we all know, psychedelics have a very interesting and very unique patenting landscape and also a very interesting prior art landscape. So these have a very long and complicated history, indigenous cultures utilizing these compounds for millennia, and then broad sweeping psychedelic use, as well as research in the early 20th century being forced underground, where much of it is still being conducted today. So the results of this activity are still being reported, but it's through relatively non-traditional sources, and unfortunately those sources are pretty far and away from the sources of prior art that are typically surfaced in routine patent and trademark office prior art searches. And unfortunately, because of this, an overly broad psychedelic patent that contains public information can be granted. A good example is this one here, which describes a DMT vape pen, something that's been very well established in prior art for nearly a decade, and therefore should have been considered unpatentable by US standards. So as you can see from this document, which is a search record the examiner used, it's a public record, mind you, all the timestamps on the right-hand side of your screen show that 2 internal USPTO databases were searched briefly, one for chemical compounds and another one for US patent documents. And unfortunately, no relevant prior art was surfaced through this search, even though there is a multitude of references that could have been utilized to reject the vast majority of these claims on the ground of anticipation. So it's also important to note that as this field is evolving, the applications associated with it are also becoming more complex in kind, utilizing higher degrees of technical jargon to try to differentiate what is claimed from the scope of the psychedelic public domain. So this can take the form of broad-sweeping Marcouche claims that include tens of thousands of chemical structures, or the use of chemical characterization aspects directly in claim language itself. So all of this serves to rebrand known and natural compounds to streamline them through the examination process. I think the most infamous, at least to date in the psychedelic space, is a strategy that Compass Pathways has used, introducing X-ray powder diffraction characterization aspects in their claims that actually survived a couple of different challenges in post-grant review. And now, not only is Compass continuing this strategy, but it's also being mirrored by other heavy hitters in this space. And it seems to be a persisting blind spot in examiner knowledge. So thankfully, there are programs that have been instituted to try to get examiners' education up to the level to then adapt to the technical aspects related to all the fields relating to patenting. However, the problem still remains that relevant psychedelic prior art is not being turned up through traditional examination search procedures. So there are ways that third parties can intervene in the patenting process by directly submitting prior art to the examiners that are evaluating these claims. And I'm going to be focusing more at the pre-grant stage, not only because it's incredibly effective, as I'll show you in a moment, but also because individuals without any legal training can participate in this process effectively. So Porta Sophia tracks and evaluates patent filings associated with psychedelics, more broadly speaking, hallucinogenic molecules. And unfortunately, over these last few years, we've seen a significant rise in the number of filings that have public information in the claim language itself. Obviously, if these claims are granted, then that public information will then become privately controlled, which would then restrict innovation as well as access in this space. So to mitigate the chance of that happening, we assemble prior art packages and submit them against these overly broad filings. So essentially this is a list of references as well as a table similar to what you see here that show on a claim-by-claim basis why this application should not be granted. So zooming in a little closer here. You can see the claim 1 is a method of treating depression in subject in need thereof, the method comprising administering an effective amount of psilocybin to a subject in need thereof. And on the right-hand side, we have a peer-reviewed scientific manuscript that states that psilocybin represents a promising paradigm for unresponsive depression, therefore demonstrating that claim 1 is not novel and therefore should not be granted. So Policy is very active in this space, filing more than 50 third-party creation and submissions with the USPTO. In total, that's about 89% of all submissions in the psychedelic space. And even though we only began submitting these in late 2021, we've already seen some staggering results. So 9 of the patent applications we submitted prior art against received rejections citing Policy provided prior art. 3 applicants have independently amended their claims to be better in line with the innovation that they're presenting. And actually, as of last week, 5 applicants have abandoned their psychedelic patent applications. So despite these successes, there are some points within this process where policy reform can be beneficial in promoting a more equitable patenting landscape. And thankfully, over these last few years, the federal government has been relatively open to receiving feedback about its processes, as shown by the request for comments on USPTO initiatives to ensure robustness and reliability of patent rights. So Policy has submitted comments to address some of the USPTO's concerns, and we're actually utilizing that submission as a foundation of what federal policy will be seeking to influence in the near future. So first, we wanted to respond to the USPTO's request to identify any specific sources of prior art not currently available through the patents end-to-end search system that we believe examiners should be searching. So unfortunately, because of this very unique state of psychedelic prior art, a lot of highly relevant pieces are going to be either locked away in physical archives or they're going to be scattered throughout public forums, and examiners do not have the resources nor the time in order to access and conduct a thorough search in order to determine whether that piece of prior art is going to be viable. So our suggestion to the USPTO is to use a more specialized prior art database. A good example of this obviously being the Policy online psychedelic prior art library, free to use for everybody. And we utilize a workflow that results in a database of mainstream, historical, archival, as well as underground sources of prior art with themes that are specifically derived from and therefore highly applicable to the most modern psychedelic patenting trends. So this provides an examiner with a single, just like one-stop means of them finding a curated list of pieces of prior art that could be utilized in psychedelic application examination. Next, we also wanted to provide a little bit of input as the USPTO revisits its procedures for third-party input. So in this request for comment, the USPTO admits that the third-party submission system is not highly used, and they wanted a little bit of feedback to see how they can engage more with the public to then utilize this intervention method. So since we are so active in utilizing this platform, working with screeners and examiners time and time again to iron out submission details in order to get it into a state of compliance so that prior art can be utilized in examination, we certainly had a couple of suggestions for them. The first of which is expanding the time period as well as the circumstances where third parties can intervene with the submission of prior art. So as it stands for now, there's a very narrow set of conditions that must be met for an individual to submit prior art through the federally accepted format. This relates to the date of publication of that application, whether the examiner has already weighed in on whether the claims, one or more of the claims would be considered patentable, or whether a notice of allowance has been provided. So there are some issues with applying these circumstances, not only in the case of expedited examination, where an application may be provided a notice of allowance even prior to publication, so the public will not have eyes on this at all before then moving to the grant stage, but also in the cases of patents moving through the traditional examination pathway as well. So we argue that expedited examination should be wholly reconsidered as a potential option for applicants, and in addition, the time period for when third parties can submit prior art should be changed to be simply before the date of final disposition of that application. This is especially important in the psychedelic field since we've seen time and time again wholesale changes to the content as well as scope of psychedelic patent claims. So by giving third parties a broader window of weighing in with prior art, we can further mitigate the chances of an overly broad filing being granted. Next, we also want to streamline the process for for prior art submission from both a administrative as well as end user perspective. So this relates to raising the ceiling, total number of references that can be submitted by an individual from 10 to 20 to better reflect the common third-party submission structure. This also would make it much more financially approachable for individuals and smaller parties that would likely be performing and actually submitting these references. And in addition to that, we also want the USPTO to be a little bit more cognizant of the time-sensitive nature of these submissions, since as it stands now, an individual may not receive any notification at all as to whether their prior art was rejected and will not be utilized in the examination process because of a simple error with the filing system related to prior art submission, so actually just referencing the reference itself. We're also seeking longer term, a little bit of a broader policy change that may be somewhat controversial, most substantive of which being fee reimbursement if a third party who submitted prior art is utilized in the examination to reject one or more of the claims on the grounds of substantiating that the claim is not novel or is really obvious to someone skilled in the art. So this would allow the irrelevant filing deterrent aspect of that fee to be maintained, but also would not put a financial burden on the individual. They're simply putting in the work to service that prior art and then submit it through the federally acceptable format. And there's also a case to be made for complete fee removal. So the third-party creation and submission system in the United States is very similar to third-party observation systems seen at the WIPO as well as many European territories. And since no abuses of these systems have yet been reported, there's precedent to mirror that same fee management strategy in the United States. So either of these changes in fee management would make this system more accessible and therefore would protect psychedelic accessibility because it would then, again, further mitigate the chances of an overly broad patent from being granted. All right, so in summary, prior art within the psychedelic space is highly unique, and unfortunately that uniqueness is leading to the monopolization of public information through the US patenting system. Third parties can significantly influence the examination of psychedelic patent applications through submissions of prior art. And policy reform to the third-party submission system can mitigate the granting of overly broad psychedelic patents, therefore ensuring longer-term biopharmaceutical accessibility to these compounds, and also ensuring that public information can remain public. So thank you all for your time and attention today. And also would like to invite you all to learn more about how we're working to protect the psychedelic public domain by visiting our website. Thank you all.
Questions? Andrew?
So, thank you for the background for this game. I'm really impressive that the
Thank you.
there. So, I'm just wondering kind of how you see your work here sort of fitting into a broader decriminalization or legalization movement. So, I mean, I guess the one thing that sort of worries me a little bit is like if it becomes that much harder to get the patent, does that actually make it harder to actually have the money that goes into the broader either decriminalization or legalization form? So I wonder how you sort of how you put kind of like the sort of incentive access to development patent law for psychedelics.
So that is a really good question. Right now, since we're so focused more on maintaining the state of the psychedelic public domain, where we weigh in on legalization and that sort of downstream effect of that is not this is something that I can speak of with any education at this point. So I'm going to hold off on commenting on it for now. But our goal in this is to protect innovation prospects by protecting the state of the psychedelic public domain and ensuring that there is no monopolization occurring in this space that is undue.
Eduardo, and then to Sarah.
So thank you. I really enjoyed your chapter. My question goes one step further related to the new World Intellectual Property Organization Agreement on Indigenous Rights. I discussed this during the day. I would ask this after the IRS call. There was no time. As far as I understand, which is not much, I'm not in law or patents, but this WIPO agreement is the first indigenous treaties agreement that is binding to the U.S. Because it was made in such a way that if 15 member states adhered, it would be valid for everybody. And we are already above 15 yes votes. Right? So I'd like to ask, how do you see that, and what are the implications, both for current patent applications related to psychedelics as well as future applications from now on?
Well, we are fully in support of ensuring that indigenous cultures have their practices protected, and we see this as a very solid win in that sense, because indigenous knowledge does fall into the scope of the psychedelic public domain. So by further ensuring that this can, essentially the robustness and the putting a little bit more onus on the applicants to kind of show what their innovation, what they're bringing to the table in order to actually be considered for patent rights, as long as that isn't infringing on anybody's cultural aspect, again, public information, then this is a very big one from that perspective. Sarah?
Yes, so I really enjoyed this a lot, and I think what it really looks impressive what you've done, but I want to push back on the idea that psychedelics are unique in this way, because we've seen it in other areas of innovation too, and the one that I think of is business methods. So an area where something is being done in a widespread kind of way, but not in the science literature necessarily, whereas patent examiners would look, and then all of a sudden there's a rush to patent it once it becomes patentable, and then you get just sort of, overlapping rights and all the problems that you've talked about. So I think we've seen it before, and they've tried, and that's where the third-party submissions came from. And there's a peer-to-patent program that Novak started that was supposed to pair scientists with examiners or have volunteer scientists come and look at patents and try to submit stuff. But none of it's worked, or it's very underutilized. So I think what you've done is really, really impressive. I think, one of the reasons is that it doesn't work is because there's no incentive for people to spend all the time that it takes to basically do the patent examination for free and then package it and send it in, right? And I guess my question is, I think what you'll end up doing, some of what I saw on your results so far is people amended their patents, and I think that's a lot of what will happen, right? Because there is a lot of space to patent things here when it's defined correctly and it's circumscribed and all of that. And so I feel like what you're doing isn't necessarily, it does help preserve the public domain, right? But it's not going to preserve sort of this robust public domain. You're still going to end up with a lot of patents in this space. And so I'm wondering, like you showed, the supporters on there, I'm wondering is that okay? Does that match your goals? If what you end up with is more specific, circumscribed patents. And I guess part of the other piece I'm wondering is, was there a problem where you were seeing lots of demand letters go out? I don't think there's been lots of lawsuits, right? But were there letters going out saying, we think you infringed on our patent, you need to stop doing this? Or were you sort of ahead of all of those things in part of this?
So, remind me one more time of your first question, just so I...
First question was just is it okay if all you end up doing is narrowing patents so that they describe things more precisely? Is that okay with you? Is that still a win?
That is a desired end result, definitely, because trying to minimize and get an applicant to be better in line with the innovation that they're presenting is the overall goal here. We just don't want the public to be infringed. So, for example, psilocybin to treat depression is the start of one claim, but then with pushback, a little bit of work, there are additional limiting features that are included, certain ratios of excipients, certain concentration of the drug itself, under what set of conditions or a certain dose regimen can then be administered. This is all limiting aspects that would then still allow for operation in this space and also prospects for future innovation as well. So we are not against patents in this space, we're against bad patents. We're promoting good patents that actually present innovation that can then be something that would not only allow for distribution, but also something to be enforceable. Your second question, I apologize.
Second question. I was just wondering if you started doing this just because of that, or did you start to see demand synthesis letters or anything like that?
I don't believe that we saw any demand letters or anything related to that. It was more so that there were so many separate individuals and entities that were trying to gain control over what is very robustly established public information to exploit a blind spot that's currently within the examination process. It's almost comes across as cheating in that way. So just because you're exploiting a loophole at this point doesn't mean that that's going to be something that's should be long-term beneficial for anybody that's seeking to do this from more of a a negative on purpose sort of perspective, rather than you may not be aware of the scope of the psychedelic public domain. Because just because this information is accessible to some, like us, we're very familiar with the scope of this space, it doesn't mean that the innovators or the individuals that are making these decisions are fully aware of that scope either. Obviously, the examiners aren't. So it's just more ensuring that that information is put into the hands of the people that need that information to make those evaluations, from either an investor, a business, or a examination perspective.
Thank you. Mason, I see a tiny little question, brief question.
Yes, I agree that narrowing claims could do a lot. But my question is, why not go farther and create a bounty for if your prior art is legalized?
We have actually had well, it wasn't a bounty per se, there wasn't a monetary prize associated with it, but we have rolled out community calls for prior art specifically relating to certain claims that were very overly broad in nature, but could be something that would be found more in an archival sense. So we have an archival researcher network of researchers, literally global scale, where they have access to these archives and translations of these formative texts from the early 20th century that could be very pivotal in rejecting some of these overly broad claims.
But I mean, would you support that as a policy?
That's a very interesting perspective. I have never actually given any thought to it, but it's definitely something I want to read up on, get a little more educated about, but it sounds interesting, for sure.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you.
That's great. Our last speaker on this panel is Phoebe Friesen, an assistant professor with the Biomedical Ethics Unit in the Department of Social Studies and Medicine at McGill University. And her presentation is The Ghosts of Psychedelic Science, Haunting and Moral Repair.
Sorry.
You still chairs?
Get a good seat.
Yeah, there's really nothing on my slides, but just so I can see them. Hi everyone, it's so nice to be here. I really enjoyed the day, and I'm looking forward to more to come. So apologies for my long paper, and this might be a bit of a change of pace, but I'm excited to talk to everyone about it. So my topic is ghosts in psychedelic science. I'm using this notion, this metaphor of haunting and thinking about moral repair. I do think there's a ton of overlap with so many things that have come up and will continue to come up today. So hopefully it'll feel generative. So I want to speak a little bit about the biomedical imaginary. I want to make this claim that psychedelic science is indeed haunted. I want to consider some of the demands related to moral repair that have been made in this space, and then ask this question about whether we should be working towards something like reconciliation or reparative justice, or there's a lot of terms that could be used in this space. So there's this great paper, some of you might have read, by Claudia Schwartz-Plagg, that's sort of discussing different imaginaries at play around psychedelics. We've heard a lot of talk about, she uses the word imaginaries, but really just different sort of potential pathways. She lays it out in terms of, legalization, decriminalization, but she says the most prominent one that really is often sort of center stage, at least in Western, particularly American discourse around psychedelics, is the biomedical imaginary. And within each imaginary, there's sort of goals, assumptions that are taken for granted, that are just sort of assumed. And I very much feel this in many spaces that I have encountered in discussion of psychedelics. There's a lot of assumptions that, the goals that we're really working towards are FDA approval, we want regulation, we want medicalization, we want to identify, what are the things, what are the particular disorders that can be helped, what are the outcomes that we want to see. There's a lot embodied within that. And in biomedical ethics, where I also work, pulling on this imaginary, the kind of central questions are shaped by those assumptions too, that we ought to think really about, the details of consent and how we can engage in appropriate consent given this. Questions around the patient-provider relationship are really central. Questions about inclusion, exclusion in clinical trials And those are all incredibly important questions that I also want to think about. But I think other things sort of get left in the background, are less easy to see. Often these sort of bigger, more difficult structural, ethical issues. So in this paper, project, chapter, I want to point towards some of those. So this is just a quote about, we should be ever more careful how the very frame of technology, in this case psychedelics as a technology, contains some worlds and delegitimates others. So I want to think about these sort of larger issues that loom in the background, many of which have already sort of bubbled up in many ways, sometimes explicitly, and think of them as ghosts, as forms of haunting in this psychedelic space. And think about what we might learn from them and how we might respond to them. So I'm going to talk about sort of 3 big ones, but I think there's more that could be discussed and these could be unpacked in different kinds of ways. So it says appropriative harms, but I've changed this to colonial harms in the paper. But this is, probably arguably the sort of specter that looms the largest in this space. And certainly, we were just talking about it, and we've heard about it a lot. So this has to do with things like spiritual consumerism, biopiracy, ecological damage related to these things. And this is an immense form of haunting in this space that is often just looming. I feel like there is just this weight of it, but because of its sort of immensity, it's sort of just left to the side so often, and it's much easier to focus on these smaller sort of piecemeal ethical issues of, but how should consent look, given sort of the immensity and incompatibility of really facing up to these. So I think of sort of one of the most commonly told ghost stories in this realm is that of Maria Sabina. We hear this so often as a kind of warning of what can happen, how extraction can look. And biopiracy, of course, is being spoken about more and more. So I think a lot of the discussions around patents that we've heard tie into this really nicely and raise these really important concerns about what kind of extraction is taking place, who's benefiting from what, and who's being excluded. So this is a big one. The next one that I want to speak to is, harms very broadly. So I'm thinking of things like MK Ultra, prison experiments, which sometimes were funded by MK Ultra, but sometimes were separate in the mid-20th century. And then sort of more recent concerns around the MAPS trials of MDMA for PTSD, particularly those covered in the Cover Story podcast. And more broadly, more worries that are really just bubbling up right now about explicit harms that take place in this space. So I think these also loom large, and they look different for different people. I work at McGill. There was a lot of really, really deeply disturbing MK Ultra funded research there. And I feel, you feel the weight of it there. And it is, there's this terrifying, beautiful building right up the hill from my office. And people love to point towards it as this terrifying thing where this evil man worked and manipulated people and locked them away for days and days and gave them tons of psychedelics to try and wipe their brains clean. But he wasn't a huge anomaly at the time. There was a lot of really problematic psychedelic research in the mid-20th century that didn't involve consent, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. I cover some really disturbing prison experiments in the paper as well. But for the sake of time, I'm going to not describe them in detail. So the war on drugs, I think, also looms large in this space and haunts different people, different communities differently. I like this quote from a therapist just considering enrolling in a psychedelics trial. I think really exemplifies the weight of the ghosts of the war on drugs today. She says, when I first learned I would have the opportunity to try MDMA as part of the MT1 study protocol, I was so scared. As a Black woman who grew up watching my communities torn apart at the hands of gang violence, the street drug market, mass incarceration, murder, etc., drugs were not a friend of mine. Not to mention the legacy and lasting impact of the war on drugs in the Black community, along with the over-policing and history of unethical medical practice on Black bodies. I was petrified. I thought to myself, you mean to tell me they want to bring me, a Black female, into a clinical setting to receive a psychedelic substance? It felt like a setup. Were the police hiding out somewhere? Would they bother me while doing absolutely nothing wrong, like so many others? Find MDMA still in my system and take me to jail? I didn't know. I just knew that because of the society in which we live, I did not and still do not feel safe. So I think this just really characterizes how different the sort of set and setting can look for different people in this kind of space. So I was really struck in reading a lot about these sort of different forms of haunting, how much the demands in relation to moral repair in this space look like those demands made in settings where there has been war crimes, horrific atrocities, and a society is working towards reconciliation or transitional justice. They're really quite similar. So things you hear a lot about are demands for acknowledgement, accountability, sometimes in the form of apology or memorialization. Compensation is a huge one, and this looks different depending on kind of case that you're looking at, but often, really a giving back of some way, acknowledging financially the harm that's been done or the extraction that's occurred. And listening, and this is like a very broad term, but often this means, making space to learn from and hear about people's experiences, but more broadly bringing people to the table to allow them an explicit sense of agency and power in constructing knowledge as we, continue to develop psychedelic science. Oh, did I just turn that off? Oh. So there's some concrete demands that I won't go into, but I might explore in my short chapter, because I'm going to have to write something a lot shorter for this book. But these are some things that I might sort of narrow in on for that as a case study that I think might align a bit more closely with the focus of this group. And I talk a little bit about risks related to reconciliation that I don't have time to explore. But the two risks that I discuss are really those that work towards, reconciling it with this sort of future focus. Like, all right, we've done it, we've reconciled, wrap it up with a bow. We don't have to worry about those concerns anymore. And those that are just really focusing on reconciling but remaining within the status quo. And I think some of the demands being made here are just not compatible with the status quo or the biomedical imaginary that we're operating within. So at the end, I sort of want to argue that haunting might be actually productive and generative and useful in this space. So maybe we don't want to be not haunted, but we do want to work towards moral repair. So this is this great quote from Chuck and Ree: haunting doesn't hope to change people's perceptions, nor does it hope for reconciliation. Haunting lies precisely in its refusal to stop. Alien to settlers and generative for ghosts, this refusal to stop is its own form of resolving. For ghosts, the haunting is resolving. It is not what needs to be resolved. Okay, I'm over time, sorry.
Thank you. Questions for Phoebe? I'm good. Christoph.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice presentation for those reading pictures. I was wondering when I read your chapter, a little bit, not just a little bit of legal perspective, but who owes these kind of reparations? And sometimes I feel that many people would agree there is something that has to be made up for, but then there is no one who's really the one to blame, so I want to go a little bit, haven't find traction between them. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think oftentimes it is really unclear who the sort of morally responsible actor or actors are. And that's when you get, especially, it's so easy to, this diffusion of responsibility. I think there are other times where there's like pretty clear claims, like in McGill where I work, there's a lot of plaintiffs who are saying, hey, we'd like acknowledgement and apology and memorialization of what happened right here to my mother. But obviously that's a big ask, and I don't know if we're going to see that, at least not in the form that a lot of people are asking for. And we can say that about a lot of the sort of explicit experiments that took place in particular places and harmed people. In other cases, like in appropriating knowledge, I mean, the patent stuff I think is another clear case when somebody is making a lot of money and we can trace something back, but it wasn't identified by a patent examiner. There seems to be a benefiting, an exploitation or extraction, or, we can tell a story there. I don't know if those claims are always being made directly to those who are benefiting. But yeah, I think there's a spectrum because I'm covering such a large territory. There is a real spectrum of cases where there might be some real clarity around responsibility and then these very fuzzy, hard to address ones. And then, yeah, things fall through the cracks. But I do think like as a community of people invested in psychedelics and thinking about them, collectively we should be generating solutions if we're thinking about ethics, policy, regulation. So it's all of you.
I'll use my moderator prerogative. Phoebe, I'm really taken with this idea of haunting, and then seeing some of what you're describing in terms of reparation and repair as it's almost inevitable to want it to be sort of an answer to the haunting, right? To sort of respond to the ghosts. And I'm wondering if there are other contexts where apology, reparations sort of have worked in your view. Like, is there a practical forward motion that can come from it, or is the haunting always there?
I think it's both. I mean, I think, so in the paper I say a little bit more about like we should be working towards these sort of like certainty making, sometimes they're called, or affirmative type actions that feel more like closure, that feel more like an explicit response to the wrong. But that doesn't mean we get to close the door entirely because, especially things something like colonialism or the war on drugs, like the harms will not be over. There will be so many intergenerational harms that persist even after we compensate people, even if we work towards, reparative measures. It's not over. The haunting will continue. So while we might take these clear actions, like the most clear maybe is compensating someone for their loss or the harm done, but that doesn't mean the harm doesn't persist, and it doesn't mean it's over. So I think, like working, the balance to me is working towards moral repair while also really embracing haunting and not trying to find that closure that, especially to the morally responsible society or whatever agent, really be deeply desired,
All right, that was a wonderful panel. We have one more wonderful panel left.